So Paradise Lost is an epic like Homer's epics and Virgil's epics and Dante's epics, and it builds on the back of them. You can read it on its own, as I did. As an undergraduate, this is one of the first books that I read, Milton's Paradise Lost. And I was not a Christian, by the way, when I read it and was introduced to it. And for me, when I say I wasn't a Christian, I did go to the United Church growing up as a child. I heard the stories about Jesus. I had read some of Scripture. I was certainly acquainted with it, but I was not deeply immersed in it. And for me, it was of peripheral significance to me. I would have called myself a Christian, but with hindsight, absolutely not. I was not. But that was the background. That was the culture. But that was 40, almost 50 years ago. And that was a different world than the one that you live in now. Canada is no longer the country that it was when I grew up. And you don't get many cultural Christians anymore. There's no value to it, being a cultural Christian. You don't get any, it doesn't do much for people to be cultural Christians. So by and large, people who are in churches tend to be Christians. They tend to be. Because otherwise, why bother? It's just not a cultural ritual as it once would have been. But when I was introduced to Paradise Lost, I was struck by the grandeur of the tale. Just the tone. I'll talk more about that when I get to Paradise Lost, next class. We'll get into that more specifically. This is just an introduction. I'm going to talk about the syllabus, which is behind me. Let me see if I can make this a bit larger. There we go. That's a little better. I'm going to talk you through the syllabus, the grading, and all that. But I want to introduce this book because for me, it was a transformative book. Not because I understood it. It was too much for me as an undergraduate. I hadn't read Homer. In fact, I'd barely heard of Homer. I had not read Virgil. I had not read Dante. Some of you won't have read that either. If you weren't in my class, then probably not. They don't do it in schools. But everyone in Milton's age, Milton who writes Paradise Lost, and that would include Shakespeare, and it would include basically Queen Elizabeth. Everyone would have not only have heard of these people, but would have read them. And these were all Christians, or purported to be Christians, and had a better claim to it than I did when I read it. Milton took Homer's epic framework and decided that he wanted to write the greatest epic of all epics. And then how to do that was his question. And what should he focus on? What would the narrative be about? And he decided to put it about the account of creation and the fall of mankind. Now those are the first lines of Paradise Lost. Of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree which brought death into our world and all our woe with loss of Eden, till one greater man restores. That's how Milton's grand epic begins. And it's the story, if you want to find biblical support for it, just read Genesis 1-3. That's most of what Milton focuses on. There's a few other. I would also recommend reading Revelation chapter 12, where it will talk about a dragon and his war on a woman who gives birth to. There's the apocalyptic account of that there. That's helpful as well. But if you read the account of Genesis, that's what Milton's epic is about. And so I'll look more specifically about that next time. But the first few classes here are going to be focused on Paradise Lost, as you can see. We'll go until January 23rd, so the next 5 classes on Paradise Lost. So if you haven't got it yet, get yourself a copy. There are countless copies. I've had this one over the years, the one by Shawcross, because it's now pretty inexpensive. I think a print copy is far superior to online. I can go on at length about why print texts are better. It's not just because I grew up with them. You can flip back and forth. There's a visual memory that goes with it. You can cross-reference, go back and forth. Online you can scroll, but there's no sense of place in it. You can even search. It's very powerful. The internet's very useful for searching things, but what it's not good for is remembering things. And memory is something that's been lost culturally, and it's been lost by embracing technology. Technology has the benefit of being very powerful. You can do extraordinary things with it, but what it does is replace your capacities. And so if you don't form those capacities, you can't utilize them. You can't draw upon your own memory. You have to consult with another thing. You have to use the crutch that's helping you to walk. And if the crutch gets kicked away, what are you going to do then? What are you going to do if you lose your cell phone? Shock, horror. Get another one immediately. Order it. Panic. What if the network goes down? Are you going to have any knowledge and ability to do anything? That's not a rhetorical question. We become very technologically dependent, and the technology also shapes and forms us. And primarily it gets us into thinking that we are disembodied, because you can converse with somebody on the other side of the world in real time. And that's a very odd experience. They're not here in the room, but they seem like they are. And you, the image of you on the screen, that's you. It's a representation of you. I'm taking a video of myself. People can watch it. That's me. You can see me. But is it all of me? It's a surface depiction, presentation of it. Eventually, you start getting habituated to that idea of a non-physical, non-temporal, non-local self. It's an icon. It's a representation of yourself. And it's debilitating. It creates anxieties. A lot of people have anxiety because of social media, because it presents a certain image of themselves, and they don't like the image, and they don't feel it's a true image of themselves, and to some degree it isn't. So when we went online for 2 years here, some students turned their screens off, even though I asked them to please put them on, because I found it unsettling to talk at a picture of myself on the screen and see blanks. I just wanted to see some faces. Are you there? But on the other hand, I know that some people don't like to see themselves on screen. They don't feel happy about that, and I don't blame them. I share your discomfort with that. Probably not at the same level, because I just don't care anymore. After a while, you just don't care. But that sense of technology and the power of technology has its benefits, but it also has its downsides. It does affect your view of human nature. Now, this course in particular, Intro, is an introduction to great literature. And what it does, I'm going to repeatedly emphasize, is it presents a certain view of human nature. It begins with Milton's Paradise Lost, which will give a Christian account of human nature, where it came from. What is its nature? What is the purpose of human life? How does that relate to previous generations? How does it relate to, I talked about Homer, the gods, the underworld. How does it relate to the matters of God? How does it relate to, in Milton's understanding, how does it relate to hell? How do those things relate to life now? Where do these things come from? How do we relate to them, etc.? Milton is going to present a Christian take on those things. As the last semester, I engaged in that very briefly when we talked about Dante, and he presented a very Catholic view of these things, taking the classical pagan view and casting it in the understanding of Roman Catholic theology of his day. Milton is a Puritan. He's a Protestant, if you will. And he's biblical. So he's going to present a biblical account. He's not going to do what Dante did, which is to begin in the middle of his life and then present a descent to the inferno and then go up through purgatory. That's a very theological conception. It's abstracted from a biblical presentation per se. Milton's is more close to the biblical text, more in keeping with Protestant sensibilities. And that's where I'll begin. So the course is here is to engage with literature, but I think you're going to find that it is also going to help you think about the way in which human nature is not something that is simply common sense. It's something that can be differently framed, differently understood, and also challenged. There's a certain view of human nature out there right now in our culture, because there always is, and it's framed by the presuppositions of our day. And those are also framed to some degree by the advent of technology. I would say just walk around the streets of Toronto and see how people act. Their faces are glued to screens. Wouldn't have been the case 10 years ago, but it is now. What's the effect of that? How does it change the way they think about themselves? How does it change the way they act towards one another? What are the benefits to that? What are the downsides to that? Is there any discussion of that at all other than on a superficial level? Psychologists will tell you that it increases anxiety exponentially. I think it has something significant influence on transgenderism and so forth as well. That's sort of the idea that I create my own identity. It's part and parcel of the same phenomenon. Inconceivable without technology. The advent of, when I say technology, the new forms of video technology and seeing myself as a picture on a screen and thinking that there's a disjuncture between what I see on the screen and who I am. That's not really me. Here's a presentation of what masculinity is like or femininity. I don't really match that. Well, what am I then? So we'll get into all of that and we'll discuss around it. So I'm going to talk about the text, but I'm going to keep on going backwards, talk about scripture, backwards and talking about how I talked about it last semester in relation to Homer, Virgil, etc., and then forwards in let's talk about how we think about that in 2023. And I hope you'll find that, again, it's an intro. For some of you, maybe the first class at Tyndale. I'm going to throw a lot at you, and hopefully some of it will stick. We'll see. Well, we'll go with Paradise Lost to start with. That, as I say, that's written during, after the fall of Cromwell's government, 1660, thereabouts, after the English Civil War. And then we will go to the period that we call the Enlightenment with a very different writer by the name of Alexander Pope. Pope writes also an epic, but it is a mock epic. He uses all the conventions that Pope's a translator of Homer, by the way, translates him into English, in rhyming couplets. But Pope will also write an epic, but it's a mock epic. He takes the conventions of the epic and he makes fun of them. It's a parody. I think you'll find it rather witty. We'll see whether you do or not. I think you will. That's my experience. Milton's epic could not be more grand. It's about the whole of the human race. So, as I say, of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree that brought death into our world and loss of Eden, till one greater man restore it. That's what he's going to talk about. Well, that's as grand as it can get. What's Pope going to talk about? He's going to talk about a young woman, aristocratic woman, who sleeps until noonday and goes out and plays cards with her friends. And there's a young gentleman who thinks she's pretty special. And he fancies her, and he decides he's going to take a lock of her hair. I don't know if you've ever seen those movies where your beloved, you give them a lock of your hair and it's kept in a little locket around your neck and stuff like that. He decides he's going to take it from her. He just stands behind her and cuts a little clip off with the scissors. That's the rape of the lock. That's the subject matter of this poem. It's as trivial as you could get. But the scandal that outbreaks, so he presents it in epic terms. I think you'll find it, as I say, quite witty. Jonathan Swift is going to come at it in the same era. He's a friend of Pope's. And he's going to write a satire. Satire is a certain type of literature known in the ancient world, one of the 5 genres of literature acknowledged in the ancient world. And he does it, by the way, one of the foremost exponents of satire is Jesus. He satirizes the Pharisees when he calls them whitewashed sepulchres and so forth. That's satire. It's not a description of what they look like. Right? They don't look like white tombs. It's a symbolized representation of what they and their teaching represent, which is death. They look good on the outside, on the inside, full of death. Their hearts are corrupt. This is a particularly savage form of satire, but there's irony that's used in it. He says one thing, the reader understands something different. Swift is going to do exactly that. He will employ satire to go after and present what he says is a very modest proposal. And I guess I'm giving it away when I say that it's not very modest at all. It's absolutely blood-curdlingly awful what he proposes. But he's writing it in the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment is connected with pretty much everything good in our culture. At least it was until about 40 years ago, when postmodernism started to set in. But the Enlightenment is associated with progress. It's associated with science. It's associated with new technologies. It's associated with the rejection of Christianity. And the idea that the Christian framework, which they inherited from authors like Milton, could be dispensed with, and we could just keep the stuff that we like. We'll get rid of the theology stuff. We'll get rid of the Christianity stuff. We'll get rid of all of those things because that's just a bunch of fairy tales. And we'll just stick with the progress that's been made in Christianity over the ancient world. We'll stick with that and we'll advance it through rationality. And humanity will be better for it. Life will be brighter and warmer and healthier, etc. Swift's modest proposal is looking at life from a non-theological framework and the problem of poverty in Ireland. And he proposes a solution to the problem of poverty in Ireland. I'm not going to give it away what his solution is. You're going to have to read the book. It's not very long, pretty brief. But you will see that from Milton's theological framework of human nature, we have moved far away from that by the time Swift comes about, and it's only a span of 50 odd years, maybe. Right in the middle of his age. Now, Swift is a Christian, but he's satirizing and using the perspective of those around him who see human nature as something that is a commodity that can be dispensed with, that can have a price put on it. You'll talk very much in terms of computation, statistics. He starts citing facts. And the statistical way of looking at life, the abstract way of looking at human nature in terms of just what's on the surface, how tall you are, how heavy you are, what color skin you have, what color hair you have, what your economic background, all of those statistical ways of looking at human nature, that begins in the Enlightenment. And it's a way of abstractly, but apparently objectively looking at human nature. And yet, it has no means of pushing back against the horrors of the perspective that it puts forward. There's no moral objectivity anymore without Christianity. And that's really what I think Swift is bringing to our attention very early on. It's the first venture at that. So we'll go from Swift, and then we'll move into what we'll call the Romantic period with Blake and Wordsworth and Coleridge. These are poets associated with Romanticism. The Romantic poetic movement begins in and around the French Revolution. Anyone know when the French Revolution was? Yes?
It was the late 1700s, like 1790s.
Not quite, but almost. And yes, very specific. 1789, Bastille Day, the day, right, where they stormed the Bastille. If you've seen, what's the third installation of the Christopher Nolan Batman? What's the third one? I know this is ancient history now. That begins. Anyway, they storm the prison and release the prisoners, and then they begin sentencing, trials, and they have their show trials because their guilt is already determined. All that comes is the sentencing. You're already guilty. You don't have to determine whether you're guilty. You are guilty by virtue of the fact that you're wealthy. You're the privileged. You're going to be, and we're going to execute you. What's the third one called? The Dark Knight Rises. Yes, that's it. It's a take on the French Revolution, but presented in terms that would probably resonate with our contemporary audience. But that's what Nolan, who clearly has read history, is presenting to us. We have a show trial here in which the downtrodden take the judicial system and overthrow it and then put their opponents, their wealthy opponents, on trial. But there's no real trial because their guilt's already been determined. It's just the sentencing that will happen. Same thing happens in the French Revolution and also in the Russian Revolution, which begins what we call communism. But that's the 20th century. We're not there yet. But the Romantic period is taking against the backdrop of that. Now, it's written in England. The French Revolution is obviously in France. And in England, the revolution never happens. There is no revolt against the aristocracy, violent by the people. That was tried in Milton's day. It had a very different character, but still, the king was executed. And a republic was announced. Same in France. But in France, the bloodletting never stopped. So they executed the aristocrats, the king, the aristocrats, and then the people who came into leadership, they said, okay, now what do we do? And there were people that were more radical than them and said, well, you haven't gone far enough yet. And what ended up happening 6 years after, it's called the Reign of Terror, is the leaders who overthrew the establishment themselves were the leaders, and now they were the subject of attack. And they were executed. And the only way to stop the anarchy was to bring in a strong man whose name was Napoleon. And he did it with an army. And then he brought the French Revolution all over Europe, liberating them from the oppression of the elites. Anyway, the Romantic movement takes place against that backdrop. Rather than revolution through violence, the Romantic project is more gentle, and I would say it's more of a theological, it's more of an intellectual attempt of thinking about human nature in worldly terms and holding on to a spirituality, or trying to, without adhering to Christian doctrine. So it is more of a quiet English way of doing the same thing that's happening in France. That's the way I'm going to present it, at any rate. And they all read Milton. They also read all of the other characters that I've mentioned thus far. But they are going to take Milton's Paradise Lost and they're going to recast it in non-Christian terminology. The chief good in the Romantic movement is nature. The Romantics are the beginning of the environmental movement of today. They hold nature to be like a divinity whom we have offended.